The cyberattack hit at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. By midnight, a billion-dollar launch was bleeding out on the floor. By 12:15, the board was already drafting termination paperwork for Isabella Hart. And somewhere in the basement of Nexus AI's headquarters, a man in gray coveralls was mopping a hallway. The only person in the entire building who actually knew how to stop it. He just hadn't been asked yet. If this kind of story, where the people nobody sees turn out to be the ones who matter most, if that hits something in you, hit the like button right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, this one's going to take a while, and it is absolutely worth it. The storm came in off the bay around 9 o'clock, the kind that didn't announce itself. No dramatic buildup, no darkening sky. One moment, the streets outside Nexus AI headquarters were dry and quiet, and the next, the rain was coming down sideways, hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor like it had a personal complaint. Derek Vaughn noticed it from the basement. He noticed most things from the basement. That was where maintenance lived, where the building's guts ran, the HVAC units, the server cooling lines, the electrical panels that nobody thought about until something stopped working. Derek had spent 3 years learning the building the way you learn a house you've lived in for a decade. He knew which hallway light flickered when the temperature dropped below 50 outside. He knew the elevator on the north side had a door sensor that needed a firm press to close properly. He knew the water pressure on the 38th floor dropped every Tuesday night because someone up there ran a dishwasher on a timer. He knew things. That had always been his particular problem and his particular gift. Tonight, he was replacing a burnt coupling on one of the cooling pumps. Routine work, the kind he could do half asleep, which was useful because he was running on about 4 hours. Mia had woken up at 2 in the morning with a nightmare and hadn't gone back down until almost 5. He'd sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, one hand resting on her back, until her breathing evened out and her small fingers unclenched from the blanket she'd been gripping. 7 years old, and she still had nightmares sometimes. He didn't blame her. She'd lost her mother at 4. Some things left a mark that small hands couldn't hold and small minds couldn't process, and so they came back at night, in the dark, when there was nowhere else for them to go. Derek had his own version of that. He just managed his in other ways. He was threading the last bolt on the coupling when his work radio crackled. Derek. It was Paul Mendez, the overnight facilities supervisor, and something in his voice was wrong, too tight. You need to come up to the main operations floor, now. I'm in the middle of, leave it, just come up. He left it. Right. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor took about 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, Derek noticed 3 things. The building's ambient hum had changed pitch slightly, which meant the server load had spiked somewhere significant. The emergency lighting strips along the elevator's baseboards had clicked on, suggesting a partial power reroute. And Paul had said now in the tone of a man who had just been told something he didn't know how to handle. The doors opened onto controlled chaos. The operations floor of Nexus AI was not a dramatic space under normal circumstances. It was rows of workstations, multiple display walls cycling through data feeds, the low constant murmur of engineers talking to each other and to headsets. Derek had walked through it dozens of times on maintenance calls, and it always looked the same. Ordered, focused, slightly boring. Tonight it looked like a boat that had just taken on water. Engineers were moving fast between stations. 3 people were on phones simultaneously. One of the large display walls was showing a cascade of red error indicators that Derek didn't need a technical background to interpret. Red was bad. That much was universal. A cluster of people he didn't recognize, suits, not engineers, people from upstairs, stood near the back wall watching the screens with the particular stillness of individuals who were very frightened but were trying very hard not to show it. Paul met him near the elevator. He was a broad, calm man in his mid-50s who had worked facilities in this building for 11 years. Derek had never seen him sweat. He was sweating now. "What's happening?" Derek asked. "The area platform is down." Paul kept his voice low. "Full system failure. Something got into the core architecture about 90 minutes ago and has been eating through the security layers. They can't isolate it, can't trace it, can't stop it." Aria was Nexus AI's flagship product, an enterprise-level artificial intelligence platform that the company had spent 4 years and somewhere north of $300 million developing. The international launch was scheduled for 72 hours from now. There were investors in 7 countries watching the countdown. There was a press event booked at a hotel 12 blocks away. How bad? Derek asked. If they don't get it back online and clean by the launch window, the whole thing collapses. Stock goes with it. Contracts go with it. Paul paused. The board is already talking about emergency options. Derek understood what emergency options meant in corporate language. It meant someone was going to take the fall for this. Why am I up here? Paul looked uncomfortable. Honestly, I don't know. I got a call from facilities management saying to pull whoever was on overnight maintenance. I think they're just grabbing bodies at this point. Derek looked at the room. He looked at the engineers hunched over their stations, running diagnostics, shouting abbreviated technical language at each other. He looked at the suits in the back, checking their phones with the frequency of people waiting for news from a hospital. He almost said something. He almost didn't. He'd learned over 3 years at Nexus that his job had a very specific shape. He fixed things. Physical things. Pipes, panels, wiring, equipment. He didn't offer opinions about software. He didn't insert himself into technical conversations. He'd learned the hard way, more than once, in more than one context, that a man in gray coveralls standing in a room full of engineers was expected to remain invisible unless directly addressed. So he stood near the wall with Paul and watched and said nothing. Isabella Hart arrived at 10:23 p.m. Derek knew who she was the way everyone at Nexus knew who she was, from a distance, through reputation, the way you know about weather systems and geological formations, things that shaped your environment without ever coming close enough to touch you personally. She was 30 years old, which still seemed implausible to most people who looked at what she'd built. She'd taken Nexus AI from a 20-person startup to a company employing over 2,000 people in under 6 years. She had a reputation for precision, for walking into rooms and immediately identifying the weakest point in any system, any strategy, any person. Employees admired her in the way people admire things that are excellent and slightly terrifying. She walked in wearing a charcoal blazer over a dark blouse, her hair pulled back, and she had the look of someone who had been pulled from somewhere important and had processed that fact and moved past it before she even reached the elevator. No visible panic. No visible anything, really, except a focused alertness that made Derek think of a surgeon entering an OR. Her head of technology, a man named Gary Whitmore, met her at the entrance to the floor, and they were immediately in a low, rapid conversation that Derek couldn't hear. She listened without interrupting, asked 2 questions, nodded once, then walked to the center of the room, and the ambient noise dropped by about 60%. "Talk to me," she said. Not loud. Didn't need to be. The lead systems engineer, a young woman named Priya, who always looked like she'd been awake for 30 hours, turned from her station. "We have a multi-vector intrusion in the core architecture. It's not behaving like anything standard. It's adaptive. Every time we try to isolate a segment, it redistributes. We've tried 4 containment protocols. None of them are holding." External origin? That's what we thought initially. All the surface markers point to an external attack, Eastern European signature patterns. But Priya hesitated. But what? The access paths don't make sense for an outside intrusion. Some of the penetration vectors are going through internal authentication channels that shouldn't be visible externally. We can't explain it. Isabella was quiet for 3 seconds. How long until launch window? 71 hours. What do we need to make this right? We need to figure out where it's actually coming from and cut it off at the source. Not patch around it. Cut it. Everything we've tried so far is just delaying the spread. Do that, Isabella said, as if it were simply a matter of deciding. She moved to the back of the room, and the intensity resumed. Derek watched her stand near the wall display, arms crossed, reading the data feeds. Occasionally, Whitmore or another executive would approach her, and she would respond in a few words. She didn't look frightened. He couldn't tell if that was because she wasn't, or because she'd learned to lock it somewhere unreachable. He'd known people like that, competence as armor. He understood it better than most. Sad. Around midnight, the room's energy shifted from urgency to something closer to desperation. 2 more containment attempts had failed. A third had actually accelerated the spread. Priya was on her fourth energy drink and her hands were doing the thing hands do when the mind is running too hot. Small, uncontrolled movements, a pen tapped too fast, fingers pressed to a temple and released. 3 of the suits had stepped out to make calls. When they came back in, they stood in a slightly different configuration, closer together, farther from Isabella. And Derek recognized that body language too. It was the language of people beginning to calculate distance from a problem. He was watching the main diagnostic display when he saw it. Not immediately. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was just standing near the wall being invisible, and his eyes moved across the cascading data the way his eyes always moved across complex systems. Not reading it exactly, more like listening to it, the way you listen to an engine and hear the note that doesn't belong. There was a pattern in the intrusion data that wasn't matching the external origin explanation. Not because the surface markers were wrong, they looked legitimate enough, but because of the timing. The intervals between penetration events weren't random. They were too regular, and they were synchronizing with something on Nexus's internal network cycle. A maintenance routine, by the look of it, something that ran on a scheduled loop. That wasn't what external attackers did. External attackers worked against systems. They didn't time themselves to internal routines they shouldn't know about. Derek stood there for a long moment. He thought about the 3 years he'd spent being invisible in this building. He thought about how that invisibility had its advantages and its costs. He thought about Priya's shaking hands and the suits calculating their distance and the 71 hours on the clock. He walked over to the workstation nearest to where Priya was standing. "Excuse me," he said. She looked up. Her expression said clearly that she did not have time for whatever a maintenance worker needed right now. "I'm not here for a technical problem," he said quickly. I think I see something in the diagnostic data, in the timing pattern." She stared at him. A man named Richter, senior engineer, mid-40s, had the particular confidence of someone who'd been the smartest person in every room he'd been in for about 20 consecutive years, looked up from the adjacent station. He took in Derek's coveralls, his maintenance badge, the wrench still clipped to his belt loop. "The timing pattern," Richter said, with a specific flatness that wasn't quite mockery but was adjacent to it. "The penetration intervals," Derek said, keeping his voice even. "They're synchronizing with an internal maintenance cycle. That doesn't match an external origin." "The signature analysis confirms external origin," Richter said. "The signatures could be spoofed." "Yes, I'm aware signatures can be spoofed," Richter said. "Thanks for the input." He turned back to his screen. Priya was already looking at her display again. Derek stood there for a moment, aware of Paul watching him from across the room with an expression that said, "Let it go, man." He started to step back. "What maintenance cycle?" He turned. Isabella Hart was standing 8 feet away, looking directly at him. He hadn't heard her move. "The building's HVAC data logging routine," Derek said. "It runs on a 90-second loop. The intrusion events are correlating to it." "Why would an intrusion correlate to an HVAC logging routine?" "It wouldn't, not an external one. The HVAC system runs on the same internal subnet as the secondary authentication servers. Someone who knew that could use it as a timing signal. Keep the intrusion pulses below the noise threshold of the security monitoring system by spacing them to the routine's intervals." The room was quieter now. Richter had turned back around. Isabella looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not hostile, not welcoming. More like she was rapidly assessing something. "Who are you?" "Derek Vaughn, night shift maintenance." A beat. "You know what you're looking at?" "I used to," he said. "Before. I did some work in security architecture. It was a long time ago." She held his gaze for another second. Then she looked at Priya. "Run it. Check the correlation." Priya ran it. The correlation was 94.7%. The room's geometry changed after that. It didn't happen all at once. Rooms don't transform in a single moment. They shift in increments, small adjustments of posture and attention that accumulate into something different. But over the next 20 minutes, the workstation where Derek was standing became a center of gravity. Priya pulled up the full diagnostic architecture and walked him through what they'd tried. Richter stood back with his arms crossed, but he was listening. Gary Whitmore appeared at Derek's shoulder and didn't say anything for several minutes, just watched. Derek asked for a chair. Nobody gave him a hard time about it. He sat and looked at the data the way he'd once learned to look at it, not searching for the obvious breaks, but reading the negative space, the places where something should be and wasn't, or where something shouldn't be and was. It was like a language you didn't forget even when you stopped speaking it. The grammar came back uncomfortable and rusty, but it came back. The origin masking is sophisticated, he said. Whoever built this understood how Nexus's monitoring system would interpret signature patterns. They built the attack to look external from the inside out. He paused. That's not something an outside team would know how to do. Not without a detailed understanding of your specific security architecture. You're saying it's internal, Whitmore said. I'm saying whoever designed this had internal access to your security documentation at minimum. Probably more. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had weight. Isabella was standing at the edge of the workstation cluster, close enough to follow, but not hovering. She asked questions in a low voice that he answered directly without trying to translate them down or up. She asked smart questions. That surprised him. Not because she was a CEO and he'd assumed CEOs were decorative, but because the questions were technically specific and they were the right ones. She knew enough to know what she didn't know, which in Derek's experience was rare and more valuable than just knowing things. Around 1:30 a.m., Richter, quietly, without announcing it, pulled a chair up next to Derek and started working alongside him. He didn't apologize for earlier. Derek didn't expect him to. They just worked. By 2 a.m., they had something. Not the source yet, but a thread. The intrusion was using what appeared to be a dormant administrative backdoor, the kind that sometimes got built into enterprise systems during the development phase and were supposed to be removed before deployment. This one hadn't been removed. It had been hidden, and it had been accessed from inside Nexus's own network using credentials that belonged to someone with executive-level clearance. That's a short list, Priya said. How short? Isabella asked. Executive admin credentials, maybe 15 people in the company. Isabella was quiet for a moment. I need that list. I can pull it, Priya said. Quietly, Isabella said. Don't route it through the standard request system. There was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of careful, measured alertness, like she'd looked at something and recognized its shape and was now moving very deliberately around it. Derek noticed it. He didn't say anything about it. He was in the middle of mapping the backdoor's access logs, tracing the timing and sequence of how it had been activated, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out automatically. It was a text from Sandra, his neighbor, who watched Mia on nights when his shift ran long. Hey? Mia woke up. She's fine, just asking for you. What time you think you'll be done? He looked at the text for a moment. He looked at the screen in front of him, at the access logs with their neat rows of timestamps and credential signatures. He typed back, probably a few more hours. Tell her I'll be home before she wakes up for school. A pause, then, tell her I love her. He put the phone away and went back to work. At 2:47 a.m., Derek found the entry point. Not just the access vector, the specific login event that had initiated the entire attack. It was buried under 3 layers of credential masking, which was why the automated systems had missed it. But sitting there in the raw access log, if you knew what to look for and you were patient enough to strip the masking away layer by layer, was a timestamp and a credential signature. Derek looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the list of executive admin credentials that Priya had quietly pulled an hour ago. The credential signature matched one of them. He sat back in the chair and pressed his palms flat against the desk and thought about what to do next. Because the credential belonged to someone with a name Derek recognized, not from personal acquaintance, but from the organizational chart he'd once studied when he'd needed to understand who controlled access to which server rooms. The name was Nathan Crosswell, the company's chief operating officer, the second most powerful person at Nexus AI. Derek thought about being escorted out of a room by security while someone in a suit watched without expression. He thought about how easy it was for institutions to decide which version of a story they preferred. He thought about Mia asking where he was. Then he pulled up a secondary terminal and began doing something he hadn't been asked to do and hadn't announced to anyone in the room. He began making copies. Not of the raw data that was already in the system. He began capturing the full access log in a format that would be readable independently of Nexus's internal systems, preserving the timestamp authentication signatures in a way that couldn't be retroactively altered. He did this quietly, and while he was doing it, he sent the files to his personal encrypted cloud storage. It took about 4 minutes. Then he turned to Isabella, who was standing 10 feet away talking to Whitmore, and he said, "I need to show you something." He showed her the access log. He walked her through the credential matching. He explained the masking layers and what their presence indicated, that this wasn't an accident, wasn't a breach by an unsophisticated actor. This was designed, planned, implemented by someone who understood the system from the inside. Isabella listened without interrupting. Her face was absolutely still. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, long enough that Whitmore shifted his weight uncomfortably. "You're certain about the credential match?" she said finally. "The authentication signature is definitive. It won't hold up as the only piece of evidence. Credentials can be compromised, but it's a starting point, and combined with the access pattern and timing, the picture is pretty clear." Another silence. "Thank you," Isabella said. Her voice had an odd quality, controlled, but with something underneath it that he recognized as the sound of a person who has just had their understanding of a situation fundamentally altered and is holding themselves together through sheer discipline. She turned to Whitmore. "I need you to stay here. Work with Priya and—" She paused, seemed to register that she didn't know Derek's last name. "Vaughn," he said. "Work with Priya and Mr. Vaughn. Continue mapping the attack architecture. Document everything." She looked at Priya. "Everything. Timestamps, chain of custody on every data point, all of it. I need it airtight." Priya nodded. "Where are you going?" Whitmore asked. Isabella was already moving toward the exit. "To make some calls," she said, and then she was gone. Derek worked until 4:15 in the morning. By the end, they had a complete map of the attack, entry point, propagation path, all 15 access events, the full scope of what had been compromised and what, miraculously, hadn't been. The Aria platform's core architecture was damaged but not destroyed. With the right team working on remediation, it was possible, tight but possible, to have it functional before the launch window. Richter, who had been working steadily beside Derek for the last 2 hours, looked at the completed map on the screen and said, "That's good work." Derek said, "Thanks." Richter said, "I should have listened earlier." Derek said, "It's fine." And it mostly was. He gathered his things, his radio, his jacket, the small notepad he always carried out of habit, and found Paul near the elevator. "You going home?" Paul asked. "I need to check on my daughter first," Derek said, "then probably sleep for about 10 hours. You good?" Derek thought about the credential signature with Nathan Croswell's name on it. He thought about Isabella's face going still and the quality of silence in the room when he'd shown her the log. He thought about the backup files sitting in his encrypted cloud storage. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." The elevator came. He got in. The doors closed. He pulled out his phone and looked at the text thread with Sandra. The last message was from 3:12 a.m. "She's asleep. She was holding her stuffed rabbit and talking about you. I told her you were doing something important." Derek read it twice. He typed back. She was right. The elevator reached the parking garage. He walked to his car, a 7-year-old hatchback with a cracked dashboard that he kept meaning to fix, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. Outside, the storm had stopped. The garage floor was wet from where water had blown in through the entrance, and the overhead lights were catching it in long pale reflections. It was quiet. The building above him held its breath. Derek started the car. He drove home through empty streets, and the whole way there he was thinking about Nathan Croswell, and about how the thing about men with power was that they rarely expected the people beneath them to be paying attention. He'd been paying attention for 3 years, and some part of him had understood, even before he'd pulled those credential logs, even before he'd shown Isabella the access map, that tonight wasn't over. Not really. The technical part might be moving toward resolution, but the human part, the part about who had done this and why and what it meant for everyone standing in that building, that part was just beginning. He pulled into his driveway. He turned off the engine. He sat for a moment in the quiet dark, and then he went inside to check on his daughter. He slept 4 hours. That was all he got before Mia padded into his room at 7:40 a.m., still holding the stuffed rabbit Sandra had mentioned in her text, and stood next to his bed with the patient, unblinking intensity that only small children and certain predatory animals can sustain. "Dad? Dad, it's almost 8. I know. You said you'd make eggs." He hadn't said that. He had no memory of saying that, but he also knew there was no universe in which he was going to argue the point with a 7-year-old who was looking at him like he was personally responsible for all of the world's disappointments. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. "You always say 5 minutes, and I always mean it." He made eggs, scrambled, which was the only kind she would eat if she was tired because fried eggs had the wobbly part that she found objectionable on some deep philosophical level he'd never fully understood. She sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas with the rabbit in her lap and talked to him about her friend Cassie's birthday party that was happening on Saturday and whether rabbits could eat birthday cake. And Derek stood at the stove in yesterday's clothes, listening to her voice fill up the kitchen the way it always did, like water finding every corner of a container, and felt the night slowly receding into something he could carry without it spilling. He dropped her at school by 8:30. She hugged him in the car line with both arms around his neck and said, "I love you, Daddy," with the absent certainty of a person who has never doubted it. And then she was gone, running toward the entrance with her backpack bouncing, already calling out to someone she'd spotted near the doors. He sat in the car line for an extra 30 seconds after she disappeared. Then he drove back to Nexus. He hadn't been called back. He'd come on his own. He told himself it was because he'd left tools downstairs, which was true. The wrench was still clipped to the bench near the coupling he'd been replacing when Paul called him up. He told himself it was professional responsibility, finishing what he'd started. He knew that wasn't all of it. The thing that had been sitting in the back of his mind since he'd driven home in the quiet dark was still sitting there. Nathan Crosswell's name on that credential log, the elegance of the attack design, the way it had been built to be misread, to point outward when the origin was inward. That kind of architecture didn't come from a contractor or a hired actor operating at arm's length. It came from someone who lived inside the institution, who understood its rhythms and its gaps, who had the patience to plan something over weeks or months and the access to execute it without triggering alarms. That was not the work of a person acting impulsively. That was the work of a person who had decided at some earlier point that the company was more valuable to them in collapse than in success. Derek had been in security long enough, even if it was years ago, even if it felt like another life, to understand that the technical evidence was one thing, the motive architecture was another, and the two together told a story that made a specific kind of sense if you were willing to look at it straight. He badged in through the maintenance entrance and went downstairs to retrieve his tools. Then he went back upstairs. The operations floor looked different in daylight, and after a few hours of relative calm, the energy had compressed, fewer people, lower volume, the specific exhaustion of a crisis that had been partially contained but not resolved. Priya was still there, which didn't surprise him. She was the kind of person who probably didn't leave until the problem was solved or she physically couldn't continue. She looked up when he came in. "You came back," she said. "Forgot something," he said, which they both understood was not the full explanation. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned her screen slightly so he could see it without having to lean over her. "We've been working through the remediation on the platform architecture. The core systems are recoverable, but whoever designed this left something else we didn't find last night." She pointed to a segment of the access log. "There's a secondary payload, dormant. It's not actively attacking anything right now, but if it gets triggered..." She paused, choosing words carefully. "It would execute a data exfiltration. Customer data, proprietary model architecture, financial projections, everything the company's built in the last 4 years." Derek leaned in. "That's not part of the cyberattack," he said slowly. "That's not about sabotaging the launch." No, Priya said. It's not. They looked at each other. Sabotaging the launch crashes the stock price, Derek said, working through it out loud. But this, he pointed at the dormant payload, this is about taking the company's intellectual property, its actual value. The launch crash is the distraction. This is the real play. Priya nodded. That's what I think too, but I haven't told anyone yet. Why not? She was quiet for a second. Because Whitmore was in early this morning asking a lot of questions about the investigation status, and the way he was asking them, she stopped. The way he was asking them what? He wanted to know specifically what we'd found about the origin point. I told him we were still working on it. She paused again. He seemed relieved. Derek straightened up. Whitmore. Gary Whitmore, Isabella's head of technology, who had stood at Derek's shoulder last night watching the investigation progress, and who, Derek now recalled, had stepped away from the floor 3 separate times to make phone calls. He thought about the credential log, Nathan Crosswell's signature on the access event. But Crosswell was COO, operations, not technology. He wouldn't have had the technical knowledge to build an attack this sophisticated. He might have had a collaborator. Where's Isabella? Derek asked. I don't know. She hasn't been on the floor since she left at 3 this morning. Derek pulled out his phone. He had no way to reach her directly. They'd spoken for a total of maybe 15 minutes across the whole night, and nobody had exchanged numbers. He thought about going through Paul, through facilities management, through whatever official channel would eventually reach someone who could reach her. He thought about how many people that information would pass through on the way. Can you get a message to her directly? He asked Priya. Not through Whitmore. Not through any of the senior staff. Priya looked at him steadily. I have her assistant's direct line. We've worked together on a few technical briefings. Can you tell her assistant that the person from last night needs to speak with her? Just that. Nothing about what we found. Yeah, Priya said. I can do that. 40 minutes later, a message came back through Priya. Conference room C, 11 o'clock. Come alone. Derek spent the 40 minutes walking the building. Not for any particular reason. He had maintenance calls he was ignoring, which was going to be a conversation with Paul later, but he needed to move. He always thought better when he was moving. It was one of the things about the maintenance job that suited him beyond the practical necessity of it. The constant motion, the building as a kind of landscape he moved through, the way physical space gave his mind something to organize itself around. He was thinking about Nathan Crosswell. The man was a known entity at Nexus in the way that powerful people are known, visible at the edges of things, present in the company's public narrative, his name attached to major operational decisions. He'd joined Nexus 3 years ago, around the same time Derek had started. He was mid-50s, had a background in enterprise operations management, came from a larger tech company where he'd run global logistics. The kind of resume that said, I know how large systems work and I know how to move through them. What Derek hadn't known, until last night, was the particular quality of Crosswell's ambition. He'd seen it before, not in Crosswell specifically, but in the type. Men who had spent decades being powerful in a supporting role, who were brilliant at execution, but who lived with the specific frustration of building things they didn't own. Men who reached a point where proximity to the top wasn't enough anymore, and who began calculating what it would take to remove the person standing between them and the position they believed they deserved. The calculation, in Crosswell's case, seemed to have landed on destabilize the company at its most critical moment, acquire the intellectual property through the exfiltration payload, probably to sell or leverage, and position himself to take over the wreckage. It was elegant in a certain horrible way, the kind of plan that assumed nobody would look at the right things, or if they did, wouldn't be believed. Derek rounded a corner in the east corridor and nearly walked into Nathan Crosswell. They hadn't met. Crosswell didn't know Derek's face, but Derek knew Crosswell's. From the organizational photos in the common areas, from the brief glimpse he'd gotten last night when Crosswell had appeared on the operations floor for about 20 minutes around midnight, stood at the back of the room, and then disappeared. Crosswell glanced at him the way senior executives glanced at maintenance staff, a brief, registering look that confirmed the presence of a person without assigning them any particular relevance, and then looked away. He was on his phone, speaking in a low voice, and as Derek moved past him, maintaining pace, not slowing, not reacting. He caught a fragment. Needs to be activated before they find the secondary, tonight if possible. I'll handle the authorization. Derek kept walking. He didn't change his pace. He didn't look back. He turned the corner and stopped, pressing his back flat against the wall, and stood there for a second with his heart going at a rate that was not consistent with a leisurely corridor walk. Tonight if possible. The secondary payload. The exfiltration. Crosswell knew they were getting close. He was moving up the timeline. Marcia. Isabella was already in conference room C when Derek arrived at 11. The room was small. A table for 8, a wall screen that was currently off, no windows. She was standing near the far wall with a coffee she wasn't drinking, and she turned when he came in. She looked tired in a way she hadn't let show last night. The controlled precision was still there, but it was running on less fuel, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested she'd also gotten about 4 hours of that. Priya said you found something else, she said. Yeah. He sat down. She remained standing, which he noted but didn't comment on. There's a secondary payload in the system, dormant. It's not part of the attack on Area. It's a data exfiltration package. Customer data, model architecture, your financial projections, everything. Isabella set down the coffee. The launch sabotage is the distraction, Derek said. The real goal is taking the company's IP, crash the stock, acquire the asset value separately. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. A realignment, like a map being redrawn. Whitmore, she said. Not a question. I don't know for certain, Derek said, but Priya said he was asking specific questions this morning about what you'd found, and the attack design requires both operational access and technical knowledge. Crosswell has the credentials, but he doesn't have the architecture background to build what we found in that system. Somebody with deep technical access helped design it. Isabella was quiet. I walked past Crosswell in the East Corridor about an hour ago, Derek said. He was on a call. He said something about activating the secondary before it gets found. Tonight. The silence in the room had weight now. He doesn't know who you are, she said. No, he looked right through me. A pause. That's the second time that's been useful. Something in her voice, not quite humor, but the ghost of it. He looked at her, and she was looking at him with an expression he didn't have an immediate category for. Not the rapid assessment from last night, something that was registering him differently, as a person rather than a variable. It lasted about 2 seconds. I need to go to the board with this, she said. I need enough evidence to act before tonight. The access logs Priya has will support the credential case against Crosswell. The dormant payload is documentable. But the Whitmore connection, Derek paused. That's circumstantial right now. His questions this morning, his proximity during the investigation, that's not enough. I know. She picked up the coffee and set it down again without drinking. What do you need? Access to the full administrative log for the last 60 days, not just the attack window. I want to see the full pattern of what those credentials have been doing. If Crosswell and Whitmore have been coordinating, there'll be traces. That's controlled access. I'd have to authorize it directly. Can you do that without routing it through Whitmore's department? A beat. Yes. Then do it quietly. And don't tell anyone what we're looking at until we have something solid. She looked at him. That particular quality of attention she had, the kind that made you aware of being genuinely seen. You're still a maintenance technician, she said. Not cruelly, more like she was noting a fact that didn't fit the current situation. Yeah, Derek said. I'm aware. Why are you still here? You found the origin last night. You could have handed it off. He thought about the answer for a moment. Not because he didn't know it, but because he was deciding how much of it to say. Because I've spent 3 years being in the building where nobody looks, he said. And I know what happens when the people who get looked at are wrong about something important. The people who don't get looked at end up dealing with the consequences. He paused. Also, there's a 7-year-old who needs her father employed. Isabella held his gaze for a second. Then she picked up her phone and made a call, and within 10 minutes, she'd authorized Derek's access to the full administrative log under her direct credentials. He worked in a small server access room off the main operations floor for the next 3 hours, going through 60 days of administrative activity across the accounts connected to both Crosswell's and Whitmore's credentials. It was painstaking work. Not technically complex, the access was wide open once Isabella authorized it, but requiring the particular kind of patience that involved looking at hundreds of routine entries to find the ones that were not routine. It was the same patience he'd applied to maintenance logs for 3 years, the same principle. Every system has a baseline rhythm, and deviations from rhythm are where the truth lives. He found the first anomaly at the 90-minute mark. 6 weeks ago, Whitmore's credentials had accessed a section of the model architecture documentation that was outside his normal operational scope, a backup partition for the original area training data. The access lasted 11 minutes. There was no work order for it, no ticket, no documentation of why it happened. On its own, it was explainable. People accessed wrong folders. But 3 days later, Crosswell's credentials had accessed the same partition. At 2 a.m., and 5 days after that, a new administrative account had been created. Buried in the system, low-level, invisible, unless you were looking for it, using an authentication string that was a variation on both credential signatures. A shared account, effectively. Created in secret. Derek sat back and looked at the screen. There it was. Not just collaboration, coordination, documented coordination, with timestamps and access trails that a competent forensic analysis would be able to verify independently of anything Derek had touched. He copied everything to the same encrypted storage he'd used the night before. Then he walked down the hall and knocked on the door of the conference room where he knew Isabella was doing back-to-back calls. She opened the door herself. There was someone on speakerphone behind her. He could hear it, a man's voice, formal, and from the cadence, it was a legal call or an investor call. She looked at his face and said to the phone, "I'll need to call you back." She stepped out of the room and pulled the door behind her. "You found it," she said. "I found enough," he said. "It's not everything, but it's a pattern, documented. 6 weeks of coordination between Crosswell and Whitmore, including a secret shared administrative account." Isabella pressed 2 fingers to the side of her jaw. Not quite a gesture of stress, more like she was steadying herself at a specific point. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is not uncertain, but who is calculating the exact shape of what comes next. "The board meeting is at 6 tomorrow morning," she said. "I called an emergency session last night after I left the floor. I told them we had evidence of the origin. I didn't tell them what it was." "Crosswell will be in that meeting." "Yes. And Whitmore?" "His department head is invited, not Whitmore directly." A pause. "I made that choice last night before I knew about Whitmore. I thought—" She stopped. "I was trying to keep the technical team stable. I needed Whitmore functional." "You still might," Derek said. "If you move on Crosswell in that meeting, Whitmore is going to know immediately. Whatever response he has ready—" "I know," she said. "I know." She said it twice, which was the first time he'd heard her repeat anything. There was a moment in the hallway between them, brief, slightly awkward, in the way moments are when 2 people are standing inside a problem that is larger than either of them and are both aware of that fact, and neither of them has a clean answer. She looked tired and precise, and something else that he didn't try to name. "Can you be here tomorrow at 6? She asked. "I work nights," he said. "I'm here anyway." "I mean in the meeting." He looked at her. "I need someone in that room who knows exactly what the evidence says and can explain it if Crosswell challenges it," she said. Her voice was matter-of-fact. "You're that person." "I'm a maintenance technician," he said. "You keep saying that like it settles something." He didn't have an answer for that. 6 a.m., she said. "Conference room A. Wear something that isn't the coveralls." She went back into the room and closed the door, and he heard her voice pick up the thread of the legal call again, smooth and direct, as if the last 3 minutes had been a brief pause in an otherwise ordinary day. Derek stood in the hallway for a moment. He thought about the backup files in his encrypted cloud storage. He thought about the 60-day administrative log with its damning pattern of timestamps. He thought about Nathan Crosswell's voice in the East Corridor saying tonight, if possible. He went back to the small server room and kept working. Because the thing about evidence was that more was better, and they didn't have tomorrow morning yet. They only had the rest of today. And somewhere in the system, A dormant payload was waiting for a signal that could come at any hour. He wasn't going to let it arrive without a fight. The secondary payload activated at 11:14 p.m. Derek was still in the server room when the alert came through. Not a system alarm, because the payload had been designed specifically to avoid triggering standard alarms, but a custom monitoring script that Priya had written and quietly deployed after their conversation that morning. She'd sent him the access credentials for the monitor with a single line of text. If this goes off, call me first. Don't go through anyone else. His phone buzzed on the desk beside the keyboard. He looked at it, looked at the screen in front of him, and felt something drop in his chest. Not quite fear, more like the recognition of a thing you'd been bracing for finally arriving. He called Priya. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "It's running," she said. "The exfiltration started about 40 seconds ago. I can slow it down. I built a rate limiter into the monitor that I can activate remotely, but I can't stop it from here. Someone needs physical access to the secondary server bank to cut the connection at the hardware level." "Where is it?" "Sub-basement 2, server row 14. Derek was already moving. "How long do I have?" "With the rate limiter, maybe 20 minutes before the first data package transmits. After that, it's continuous." "Activate it," he said. "I'm going down." He took the stairs. Sub-basement 2 was below his normal maintenance territory. It was the older infrastructure layer of the building, pre-renovation, the kind of space that smelled like cold concrete and old cabling, and was lit by overhead fluorescents that hummed at a frequency just below conscious irritation. Derek had been down here maybe a dozen times in 3 years, mostly for cooling line checks. He knew the layout well enough. He found server row 14 in 4 minutes, which was faster than he'd expected. And he was reaching for the physical isolation switch on the secondary bank when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Gary Whitmore was standing at the end of the row. He was in a suit jacket over a t-shirt, the specific appearance of a man who had been called back to the building in a hurry. And he was holding his phone at his side, and his expression had the particular quality of a person who had just arrived somewhere they needed to be before someone else arrived. They looked at each other across about 15 feet of server equipment. "Mr. Vaughn," Whitmore said. His voice was careful, controlled, the voice of someone who was good at controlling their voice. "I didn't expect to find you down here." "I work here," Derek said. "Night maintenance, yes." A pause. "You're quite far from your normal service area." "Got a work order," Derek said. He didn't move his hand away from the isolation switch. Whitmore looked at his hand, looked at the switch. Something passed across his face, quick, almost invisible, the micro-expression of a man doing a rapid calculation. "I'd leave that alone if I were you," Whitmore said. "Why?" "Because you're a maintenance technician who has been spending the last 20 hours inserting himself into a very sensitive technical investigation. And the people running that investigation—" He stopped, seemed to choose a different approach. "Look, I know you think you've found something. I know Isabella has been listening to you, but you're operating in a situation you don't fully understand, and making a move like that—" He nodded toward the switch. "Right now would be a mistake that I don't think you can come back from." Derek kept his eyes on Whitmore. "Is that a threat?" "It's an observation." He spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a reasonable man making a reasonable point. "You've done good work, genuinely. Identifying the timing correlation last night was sharp, but there's a larger picture here, and what you're about to do is going to disrupt something that goes beyond what you understand." The exfiltration package. A very brief pause. The controlled data transfer that is part of an authorized operational process that you would know nothing about because it's above your clearance level. It was smoothly said. It had the shape and texture of a plausible explanation, the kind that sounded reasonable in the moment and would take time to disprove. Derek recognized, because he'd spent years studying systems that were designed to misdirect, the art of building something that looked like one thing from the outside while being another thing entirely. "Nathan Crosswell authorized it?" Derek asked. "The authorization structure is—" "Because I found the shared administrative account," Derek said, "the one you and Crosswell created 6 weeks ago, the one that was used to access the ARIA backup partition, the one that shows 60 days of coordinated activity." Whitmore was quiet. "I've got all of it," Derek said. Timestamps, access paths, the credential trail. It's already off-site. So whatever you're about to say about authorized operational processes, you might want to think about whether the board is going to buy that at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. The fluorescence hummed. Somewhere in the rows of servers, a cooling fan cycled up and then down. Whitmore's expression had changed. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for that, but the reasonableness had receded, and what was underneath it was harder to name. Not quite anger, more like the look of a person who had made a very long, careful plan and was now watching it develop a crack in a place they hadn't accounted for. "You should go home," Whitmore said. "Go home to your daughter. Let this—" "Don't," Derek said. His voice came out flat and a lot colder than he'd intended. "Don't bring her into this." A beat. Whitmore raised his hand slightly. Derek held his gaze for one more second, then flipped the physical isolation switch. The indicator light on server row 14 went from green to red. In Priya's monitor, somewhere upstairs, the exfiltration feed would be showing terminated. The first data package had not transmitted. 20 minutes, she'd said, with the rate limiter. He'd made it in 11. Whitmore stood there. He didn't move to stop him. He just stood there with the expression of a man revising his calculations. "You made a mistake tonight," Whitmore said quietly. "Probably," Derek said. "Happens." He walked out of the server row and didn't turn his back fully until he'd put enough distance between them that it didn't matter. "Was," he called Priya from the stairwell. "It's cut. Package didn't transmit." "I see it," she said. He could hear her exhale. "Whitmore?" "He was down there." Silence for a second. "Did he—" "He tried the authorized process explanation. I told him what I had." He backed off. A pause. "For now." "Derek." Her voice had changed. "He's going to move. If he knows you have the 60-day log, he's not going to wait for the board meeting. He's going to do something tonight." "I know. You need to tell Isabella." "Yeah." He hung up and stood in the stairwell for a moment, one hand on the metal railing, and thought about the specific geometry of what was happening. Crosswell and Whitmore had built a plan with multiple layers. The launch attack as distraction, the exfiltration as the real payload, and presumably some kind of contingency for if things went wrong. He'd cut the exfiltration. They knew he had the evidence. The board meeting was 7 hours away. The contingency was probably already in motion. He texted the number Priya had given him for Isabella's assistant and wrote, "Need to reach her now, not in the morning, now." The reply came back in 4 minutes. "She'll call you in 10. He went upstairs to wait. His hand was steadier than it had any right to be. Isabella called at 11:52 p.m. "Whitmore was in the sub-basement," Derek said without preamble. "The payload activated. I cut it at the hardware level before the first package transmitted, but he was there. He knows I have the 60-day log. He used the authorized process line, I called it. He backed down, but Priya thinks they're going to move tonight." A silence on her end that lasted about 4 seconds. "Where are you now?" "Third floor common area." "Stay there. I'm 20 minutes away." "You don't have to come in." "I'm already in my car," she said, and hung up. She arrived in 18 minutes, which meant she'd been driving fast. She came through the executive entrance on the east side. Derek had been watching the lobby feed on the facilities monitor, and she was still in the clothes she'd presumably been wearing all day. The charcoal blazer now wrinkled at the elbows, her hair slightly less precise than it had been. She found him in the common area and sat down across from him without the hesitation she'd had the first 2 days, the deliberate physical distance that executives maintained around staff. Either she'd stopped noticing the distinction or she'd decided it didn't matter right now. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the moment the alert came in." He told her. All of it, including the specific words Whitmore had used, the authorized process framing, the "don't bring her into this moment" that had hit differently than Whitmore had probably intended. Isabella listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she sat with it for a moment. "He mentioned Mia," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before, something that was not quite indignation, but adjacent to it. Tangentially, he said, "Go home to your daughter." I don't know if he knew her name. "It doesn't matter," She paused. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have been in that position. It's fine. It's not, actually. She said it simply, without making a production of it. You've been handling this alone and you shouldn't have been. That's on me. I was trying to keep the circle small and I made it too small. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. She moved on. The board meeting is at 6. I have the evidence you compiled. I have Priya's technical documentation, and now I have your account of tonight. But Crosswell is going to come into that room having spent the last several hours building a counter-narrative. What's his counter-narrative? The most obvious one. She looked at him directly. You, a maintenance worker with no current credentials, no official role in the investigation, who somehow had access to the administrative logs, who was in restricted areas in the middle of the night, who appeared out of nowhere and made himself central to a crisis response. She paused. If I were Nathan, that's the story I'd tell. I'd say you were the inside actor and that you manipulated me into trusting you. The common area was empty around them. The building had settled into its late-night mode, quieter HVAC, fewer lights in the corridors, the distant rhythm of the cleaning crews on the upper floors. Derek looked at her. Do you believe that? No, she said, without hesitating. Why not? She was quiet for a second. Not because she was uncertain, he thought, but because she was deciding whether to say the actual reason or a more professional version of it. Because I've watched you work for 2 days, she said, and the people who are running a con look a specific way under pressure. You don't look like that. A beat. Also, frankly, because if you'd wanted to damage this company, you had 3 separate opportunities to let the exfiltration run, and you didn't. You ran down to the sub-basement at midnight and you cut it. That's not a great argument to make to the board, he said. He said, she said. No, she agreed. That's why the evidence has to carry it. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling my outside legal counsel tonight. I want an independent forensic team brought in to verify the administrative logs before the meeting. Crosswell's going to know you're moving. He already knows. The moment you talked to Whitmore in that server room, they knew. The question isn't whether they know. It's whether we get to the board before their version of the story does. She was already dialing, then she stopped, looked up. The backup files. You said you stored them off-site. Encrypted cloud storage, my personal account. I need copies on independent storage that my legal team controls. Can you transfer them tonight? Yeah. She nodded. Made the call. Spoke for 3 minutes in the low, precise language of someone who had done crisis legal calls before. This is what I need. This is the timeline. This is non-negotiable. And when she hung up, she looked marginally less like a person holding a structure together with both hands. Forensic team will be here by 3 a.m., she said. Legal counsel at 4:30. Board meeting at 6. What do you need from me until then? Stay here. Don't go anywhere alone. And, she paused, which was unusual for her. Is there anyone you need to call? Mia's at... She's with my neighbor. She'll be fine until morning. Okay. A pause that lasted a beat longer than necessary. What was she like? When you talked about her before, you said she had nightmares sometimes. The question was unexpected enough that he looked at her directly instead of sideways. She's 7, he said. She's stubborn. She has strong opinions about eggs. A pause. She looks like her mother. She doesn't know that yet. Isabella was quiet in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just present. How long has it been? She asked. 3 years since I lost her. 4 since things started going wrong. He paused. That's more than you asked. It's not, she said. Huck. The forensic team arrived at 2:58 a.m. 3 people from an independent cybersecurity firm, all carrying equipment bags, all with the brisk efficiency of professionals who had been pulled from sleep and were fine with it. Isabella briefed them in the conference room, while Derek transferred the off-site backup files to a secure partition under her legal team's control. It was during the transfer that his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Vaughn. Nathan Crosswell's voice. Unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided to skip a step. I think we should talk before this gets further out of hand. Derek said nothing. He kept the phone to his ear and kept his expression neutral, aware that he was sitting in a glass-walled room and that several people could see him. "I know what you found," Crosswell said. "I know what you think you know. I want to offer you some perspective." "I'm listening," Derek said, "because sometimes you learned more by listening than by talking." "Isabella Hart is a gifted executive," Crosswell said. "She built something remarkable. But there are people, investors, board members, who believe the company has reached a point where her vision isn't sufficient for the next phase. The changes that are coming at Nexus are inevitable. The only question is whether they're managed or whether they're chaotic." A pause. "You could be part of that management, a man with your background, your actual background. Not the coveralls, the other one. There's a significant role available in a restructured organization." Derek looked at the file transfer progress bar on his screen, 43%. "What kind of role?" he asked. "Head of security architecture, real compensation, not a maintenance salary." Another pause. "And frankly, for a father raising a child alone, stability matters more than principles." 61%. "I appreciate the offer," Derek said. "I'd appreciate an answer." "I know." 78%. "I'm going to need some time to think about it." "You have until 5 a.m., Crosswell said. "After that, the conversation I'm having with the board changes in nature, and your part in it changes too." The call ended. 94%. Then 100. Derek set the phone down and sat very still for a moment. Crosswell had just confirmed, on a recorded line, because Derek's phone had been set to record incoming calls since midnight, a precaution he'd taken after the conversation with Whitmore, that he had board members aligned, that he was planning to present a specific narrative at the meeting, and that he'd attempted to bribe a witness. Derek picked the phone back up and walked to the conference room and knocked on the glass. Isabella looked up. He held up the phone. Her eyes sharpened. He opened the door. "You're going to want to hear this," he said, and played the recording. The hours between 3 and 6 a.m. had a specific quality that Derek associated with the tail end of difficult nights, a kind of dense, pressurized stillness, where everything moved slowly and yet nothing felt slow. The forensic team worked. The lawyers worked. Isabella worked, at the head of the conference table, going through documents with a focus that didn't flag or soften. Derek worked beside Priya, who had come back in at 3 with coffee she didn't offer to share because she was already drinking it, and who had the look of a person who had simply decided that sleep was a later week concern. Around 4 a.m., the forensic team lead, a compact woman named Torres, who communicated almost exclusively in declarative sentences, came into the conference room and said, "The 60-day log is verified. Chain of custody is intact. The shared administrative account shows 43 discrete access events. We can present this independently." Isabella nodded once. "Good." At 4:30, her legal counsel arrived, a man named Adler, 60-something, with the particular calm of a lawyer who had spent decades in rooms where things were falling apart and had developed an immunity to ambient chaos. He reviewed the materials, asked 12 questions in rapid succession, received 12 answers, and said, "We can proceed." At 5:15, someone, Derek never found out who, apparently alerted Crosswell that the forensic team was in the building. Because at 5:20, Isabella's assistant forwarded her an email that Crosswell had sent to 3 board members, time-stamped 5:17 a.m. She read it. Her expression didn't change, but she handed her phone to Adler. Derek watched Adler read it. Adler's expression also didn't change, but he set the phone down on the table and said, "He's claiming the administrative logs were accessed and potentially altered by an unauthorized party, specifically a night shift maintenance employee." The room was quiet. Derek had been waiting for this. He'd been waiting for it since the conversation with Whitmore in the server room, and then with more certainty after the phone call. It was the cleanest move available to Crosswell once the evidence was established. Not deny the evidence, but contaminate the source. Make the chain of custody questionable. Make Derek the variable that couldn't be trusted. "Can he make that stick?" Priya asked. "Briefly," Adler said. "With board members who want to believe it, and who receive it before they receive our materials. Yes, briefly." Isabella was looking at her phone. She looked up and found Derek across the table. "He's going to walk into that meeting and say you tampered with the evidence. that I was manipulated by someone I trusted without verifying, that everything we have is compromised. I know, Derek said. Is there anything? She started. The recording, Derek said. He confirmed the bribery attempt on a recorded line. That's not evidence I could have tampered with. It's a real-time audio record with a verifiable timestamp and his voice on it. He can explain away the administrative logs as contaminated. He can't explain away his own voice offering me a job at 5 a.m. to change my testimony. Adler looked at him. It was the first time the lawyer had really looked at him, assessed him, in the way Adler probably assessed everyone, as a variable in a situation. The recording is clean? Adler asked. Automatic call recording, unedited. Timestamp authentication is verifiable through the carrier. Adler nodded slowly. That changes the geometry of the meeting. Yeah, Derek said. I thought it might. At 5:55 a.m., Derek went to the men's room on the 32nd floor and looked at himself in the mirror. He'd changed into the spare clothes he kept in his locker, dark jeans, a plain gray shirt that was wrinkled from having been folded for 2 weeks. Not great, not terrible. He looked like a man who had been awake for most of 24 hours, which was accurate. He thought about Nathan Crosswell, at this moment probably walking into the building from the parking garage, running his counter-narrative in his head, preparing to walk into a boardroom and dismantle a maintenance worker's credibility in front of people who were already predisposed to find the story implausible. He thought about how Crosswell had said, for a father raising a child alone, stability matters more than principles. The assumption embedded in that a person in Derek's position could be purchased, that the math of desperation was simple enough to solve with a salary offer. He dried his hands, looked at himself one more time. He had been invisible in this building for 3 years. That was ending this morning, one way or another. He wasn't sure exactly what came after it. He went to find out. Conference room A was on the 42nd floor, which Derek had never been to before. It was the executive level. A different building in the same building, the way those floors always were. Quieter carpet, better lighting, the kind of furniture that announced its own cost without being ostentatious about it. The conference room itself had a long table that seated 16 in a wall of windows facing the bay, and at 6 in the morning the water was gray and flat under a sky that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it wanted to be. Derek stood near the back wall while people filed in and felt the specific discomfort of being in a room you don't belong to. Not the kind that makes you want to leave, the kind that sharpens your attention, that makes you notice every small signal. There were 11 board members. He recognized some faces from the company's public communications, the kind of faces that appeared in annual reports and press photos. Older, mostly, the accumulated weight of institutional authority in their posture. They sat down without much conversation, the way people sit when they've been pulled from their normal morning routines and haven't fully metabolized why yet. Adler sat up at one end of the table with his associate and a laptop. Torres from the forensic team sat beside him. Priya was near the middle, slightly apart from the board members, with her own laptop open. Isabella was at the head of the table. She'd gone home at some point between 5 and 6. Derek hadn't seen her leave, but she came back changed, hair composed, a different jacket, the particular quality of someone who had made a deliberate effort to look like the person the room expected to see. He wasn't sure how she'd managed it in under an hour. Some form of discipline he didn't have access to. Nathan Crosswell arrived at 6:03, which was exactly late enough to be a statement. He was in a dark suit, no tie. The deliberate informality of a man signaling ease. Gary Whitmore walked in 30 seconds behind him and took a seat at the far end of the table without making eye contact with anyone. Crosswell saw Derek standing near the back wall. Their eyes met for a moment. Crosswell's expression was neutral and controlled and communicated absolutely nothing, which was itself a communication. He sat down 2 seats from Isabella's right. Isabella opened without preamble. 3 nights ago, Nexus experienced a sophisticated cyberattack targeting the Area platform. By now, most of you know the basic facts. What you don't know is the full picture of what that attack was, where it came from, and what its actual purpose was. That's why we're here. She paused. I'm going to present evidence that is uncomfortable. I'm asking you to stay with it. One of the board members, a man named Hargrove, mid-60s, the kind of face that had learned to convey skepticism as its default expression, said, Isabella, I received an email this morning raising concerns about the integrity of the investigation. I think we need to address that first. We will, she said. At the appropriate point, let me present the evidence in sequence. It matters that you hear it in sequence. Hargrove leaned back. Not agreement, but tolerance. Adler walked through the technical evidence first. The forensic team's independent verification of the 60-day administrative log, the access patterns, the shared account. He presented it the way lawyers present things to boards, methodically, without drama, each point supported by documentation that appeared on the wall screen as he spoke. The language was deliberate. The chain of custody was explicit at every step, which Derek understood now was a specific anticipation of Crosswell's contamination argument. Torres added the forensic authentication at 3 points, confirming in flat, technical language that the log data was unaltered and that the verification process had been conducted independently of Nexus's internal systems, using the firm's own tools. The room listened. Crosswell listened. He had the posture of a man at a dinner party who is waiting for the host to finish telling a story he finds tedious. When Adler finished the documentary evidence, Isabella said, "Before we move to the next item, I want to address the email some of you received this morning." She looked directly at Crosswell. He met her eyes without flinching. The email alleges that the administrative logs were accessed and potentially altered by an unauthorized party, specifically the maintenance technician who identified the origin of the attack. I want to be clear. The forensic team you just heard from worked entirely from independently preserved copies of the data, with full authentication verification. The chain of custody has been validated externally. That allegation doesn't survive contact with the evidence. Hargrove said, "Who is the maintenance technician, and why was a maintenance worker involved in a cybersecurity investigation in the first place?" Isabella said, "His name is Derek Vaughn, and he's in this room." She didn't gesture, didn't look toward Derek, just stated it. He's here because he identified the attack's origin when every other person in this building missed it, and because the evidence he developed has been independently verified as accurate. A pause. He's also here because last night, Nathan Crosswell called him directly and attempted to bribe him to change his testimony before this meeting. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Nobody gasped, nobody stood up. But the quality of the silence changed, the way a room's acoustics change when people stop moving and start listening very hard. Crosswell said, "That's a serious accusation." "It is," Isabella said. "That's why I have the recording." She played it through the room's speaker system. Adler had loaded the audio file with the carrier-verified timestamp authentication running simultaneously on the wall screen. The timestamp ticking in real time as Crosswell's voice came through the speakers, the authentication signature visible, the phone number source confirmed. Derek stood near the back wall and listened to his own voice say, "I'm going to need some time to think about it." And Crosswell's voice say, for a father raising a child alone, "Stability matters more than principles." And the room was very, very quiet. When it ended, Crosswell said nothing for a moment. Then, "That recording could have been edited." "The carrier authentication confirms it wasn't," Adler said. "The timestamp is continuous and unbroken. Editing would have broken the authentication chain. It didn't." "I'm not going to sit here and—" "Nathan." One of the board members, a woman named Chen, who had been sitting very still through the entire presentation and who had the focused quality of someone processing quickly, said his name, and that was all. Just his name. The tone did the rest. Crosswell looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. A very small change, the first crack in the surface. "The access logs show 43 coordinated events over 60 days, Chen said. "The forensic team has verified the data independently. Your voice is on a recording attempting to bribe a witness the night before a board meeting. I want you to understand that I'm not asking you to explain that. I'm telling you that the board has heard it." Whitmore, at the far end of the table, was looking at his hands. Crosswell turned to Isabella. When he spoke, the ease in his voice was still there, but it was working harder now, running on something that was closer to performance than the real thing. "You want to talk about judgment? You brought a maintenance worker into a sensitive corporate investigation. You gave him access to executive-level administrative logs. You made him central to a security crisis response and then brought him into a board meeting. He spread his hands. That's the story here. Not me. Your judgment. Isabella said, My judgment brought in the only person who correctly identified the attack when 6 trained engineers couldn't. My judgment led to the exfiltration package being cut before a single byte of data left this building. My judgment is why Nexus still has its intellectual property and a functioning ARIA platform with 48 hours to launch. She paused. You want to debate my judgment, Nathan? Let's do that. The room was with her. Derek could feel it, not because people were visibly reacting, but because of what they weren't doing. Nobody was nodding along with Crosswell anymore. Nobody was looking at him for the cues they'd been taking from him. Hargrove said, What happened with Whitmore? Isabella looked at Whitmore. He'd been so still and so quiet for so long that the act of becoming the room's focus seemed to physically change his size. He looked smaller than he had at the other end of the table. Gary, Isabella said. The use of his first name was not gentle. It was just precise. The shared administrative account, 43 access events, your credentials on the area backup partition at a time when there was no work order and no documentation. She paused. I need to hear from you directly. Whitmore looked at his hands. Then he looked at Crosswell. Crosswell didn't look back at him. That was the moment. Derek saw it happen. The specific moment when a person realizes that the alliance they've been operating inside has already dissolved, that the person they've been coordinating with has already moved to a position that doesn't include them. Whitmore's face did a complicated thing, a series of micro-adjustments that amounted to a reckoning happening in real time. I want to speak to legal counsel before I say anything further, Whitmore said. That's your right, Adler said. Gary, Crosswell started. I said I want counsel, Whitmore said, and there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not exactly anger, something more like the specific relief of a person who has made a decision and is done pretending they haven't. The next 40 minutes were not clean. Board meetings in crisis are rarely the decisive, dramatic moments they become in retrospect. They're messy and repetitive and full of people talking over each other and asking the same question in slightly different ways because they're processing something they don't want to be true. Hargrove argued for a postponement of any action pending a fuller investigation. Chen pushed back. 2 other board members wanted legal counsel for the full board before proceeding. Adler navigated the procedural questions with the patience of a man who had attended many rooms exactly like this one. Crosswell tried twice more to steer the narrative, once toward a procedural argument about the chain of custody that Torres dismantled in under 3 minutes, and once toward a broader argument about management philosophy that Adler cut off cleanly by returning to the specific evidence. Each attempt landed with less force than the previous one. Derek stood near the back wall through all of it. Nobody addressed him directly after the recording was played, which was fine. He wasn't there to speak. He was there because Isabella had wanted someone in the room who knew the evidence cold, and because his presence was itself a kind of testimony, a physical fact that Crosswell couldn't argue away. At 7:14 a.m., the board chair, a man named Fells who had said almost nothing for the entire meeting and who had the quality of stillness that comes from knowing when to let a room run and when to stop it, said, I'd like to call for a motion. Crosswell said, Robert, Nathan. Fells looked at him. You should probably stop talking now. The motion was a suspension pending a full external investigation. It passed 9-2, the 2 dissenting votes being board members who had been in Crosswell's sphere and who voted no in the reflexive way people vote for the person they've been aligned with even after the alignment has stopped making sense. Crosswell sat for a moment after the vote. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the room without saying anything. The door didn't slam behind him. He had too much control for that. But the quality of his exit, the specific absence of the ease he'd walked in with, said everything that the controlled exterior was trying not to say. 2 board members followed him into the hallway. Derek didn't know what was said out there. Whitmore didn't leave. He sat at the far end of the table looking at the middle distance until Adler's associate quietly moved to sit beside him, and whatever conversation they were beginning was the beginning of a different kind of accounting. Isabella caught Derek in the hallway outside conference room A at 7:40 a.m. The floor had emptied quickly. Board members dispersing to phones and laptops, the specific urgency of people who had decisions to implement and communications to manage. Adler was on his own call down the hall. Torres had already packed up and was heading to the elevator. Isabella looked like someone who had been running hard for 40 hours and had just stopped and hadn't decided yet what to do with that. "The launch is still on," she said. "Priya thinks the remediation will be complete by tonight. 48 hours from now, area goes live." "Good," he said. A pause. "The board wants to issue a public statement about the investigation. Legal is drafting it now." She paused. "Your name will come up. I wanted you to know before it does." "How will it come up?" "As a Nexus employee who identified the breach and assisted with the investigation." She looked at him. "Is that okay?" "I'm still a maintenance technician," he said. "You're a maintenance technician who saved the company," she said, and her voice had a flatness to it that wasn't dismissiveness. It was the sound of a person stating a fact they're still slightly amazed by. "I'm aware that's a strange sentence. It's a strange couple of days." She almost smiled. He'd seen it once before. Not a full smile, just the near approach of one. The expression of a person who has learned to keep that particular response contained and occasionally doesn't. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't." "I dismissed you on the first night, when you came over to the workstation." She said it directly without the softening that people usually put around admissions like that. "You were right, and I dismissed you because of what you were wearing. That cost time. It could have cost more." "Richter dismissed me too," Derek said, "and he ended up being useful." "That's a generous read. He worked solid for 4 hours. He doesn't owe me an apology either." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the hallway windows, the bay had turned from gray to something lighter, the sky making up its mind, finally, toward morning. "What do you want?" she asked. The question was direct and slightly awkward in the way of a person who doesn't usually ask it. "Going forward, you've been doing maintenance here for 3 years. That's not—" She paused. "Is that what you want to keep doing?" He thought about it honestly, which was harder than it should have been, because the maintenance job had been, in a specific way, a chosen diminishment. He'd taken it 3 years ago when Mia was 4, and he was a man with a specific kind of grief and a daughter who needed stability more than she needed ambition. He'd taken it because it was nights, and it was reliable, and it was the kind of work where the problems were concrete and solvable, and nobody needed him to be more than he was capable of being on 4 hours of sleep. He'd made a smaller life on purpose. "I don't know," he said, which was the honest answer. "I'm going to need a head of security architecture," she said. "Not right away, not while things are still landing, but the role is going to need to be filled by someone who actually understands what just happened and why it happened and how to make sure it doesn't happen again." She held his gaze. "I'm not offering it to you right now because this is not the right moment to offer someone a job. I'm telling you it's going to exist." "That's a distinction," he said. "It's an important one." A pause. "Think about what you want. You have time." She looked at her phone. "I have to make 12 calls in the next hour." She started to move down the hallway, then stopped. "Derek." He looked at her. "Go home to your daughter," she said. Not the way Whitmore had said it. That had been a warning dressed as consideration. This was just what it was. "You've been here long enough." He took the elevator down. He was in the parking garage when his phone rang. Sandra. "Hey," he answered. "Hey, Mia's up. She ate cereal. I know, you usually do eggs, but she asked for cereal, and I said, okay." A pause. "She's asking when you're coming home." "I'm leaving now," he said. "She wants to know if you got her message." "What message?" "She made me text it last night. She drew a picture of you and her, and she described it to me so I could send it. I think she thought you could read it somehow." A pause. "She drew you really tall, and she gave you a cape." Derek stood next to his car in the garage and pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead and breathed. "Tell her I got it," he said. "Tell her I'll be there in 20 minutes. He got in the car. He sat for a second with both hands on the wheel. He was 32 years old. He had gray at his temples that had started at 29. He had a 7-year-old daughter who drew him with a cape and a neighbor who texted at midnight and a cracked dashboard he kept meaning to fix. He had skills he'd put away in a drawer 3 years ago and taken back out 2 days ago, and they'd worked, which was either something or nothing depending on what he decided to do with it. He had a lot to figure out, but first he had eggs to make. He started the car and drove home, and the city was waking up around him in the slow gray way of early mornings, the streets filling with the ordinary traffic of people going to ordinary places. And it didn't look like a city that had almost lost something enormous the night before. It just looked like a city. That was the thing about crises, he thought. They happened in specific rooms in specific buildings, and then they were over, and the world outside those rooms kept going without knowing anything had changed. But things had changed. He just didn't know yet exactly how much. He slept until 2 in the afternoon. Not straight through. Mia came in at 11 and climbed onto the bed and lay beside him with her stuffed rabbit pressed between them, not waking him exactly, just being there in the way she had, present and warm and slightly too close to his face. He was aware of her without being fully conscious, and somewhere in that half-sleep he reached out and put his arm around her and she settled in and they both slept for another hour and a half like that, which was probably the best hour and a half of the entire preceding week. When he finally came fully awake, she was sitting up beside him eating crackers from a sleeve she'd apparently retrieved from the kitchen herself, dropping crumbs on his blanket with the serene indifference of someone who was not going to be doing the laundry. "You were really tired," she said. "Yeah. Sandra said you were doing something important." "I was." She considered this, chewing. More important than sleeping? It felt like it at the time. She handed him a cracker. It was the kind of thing she did. Not asked if he wanted one, just handed it to him, the assumption of sharing so natural it didn't occur to her to frame it as an offer. He ate it and looked at the ceiling and thought about the board meeting and Nathan Crosswell's controlled exit and Isabella's voice in the hallway saying, "Go home to your daughter." And then he thought about the cracker, which tasted like salt and processed wheat and was, in that moment, the best thing he'd eaten in 2 days. "Dad," Mia said. "Did you save something?" He looked at her. She was 7 and she had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown that caught light at an angle and went amber. And she was asking the question with the directness that children have before they learn to soften things. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her crackers. He lay there for another few minutes and stared at the ceiling and felt the specific weight of the last 72 hours begin, slowly and incompletely, to lift. The area launch happened the following morning at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Derek watched it on his laptop at the kitchen table while Mia was at school. He wasn't there. Nobody had invited him, and he hadn't expected to be. But the company streamed it live on its public channel, and he sat with coffee and watched Isabella stand at a podium in a hotel ballroom 12 blocks from headquarters, in front of a room full of investors and journalists and international partners, and deliver a 40-minute presentation about what Area was and what it was going to do and why it was going to change the way enterprise AI operated. She was extraordinary at it. That was the only word. He'd seen her work under pressure, in a crisis, in a boardroom at 6 in the morning. He'd seen her tired and guarded and making calculated gambles. This was different. This was the version of her that had built the company in the first place, the one that saw the shape of a future and could make a room full of skeptical, expensive people believe in it too. She spoke without notes. She fielded the questions that came after with a precision that made complicated answers sound like obvious ones. At no point during the event did she mention the cyberattack. She didn't mention Crosswell. She didn't mention the board meeting or the exfiltration attempt or the 48 hours that had nearly collapsed everything she'd built. She just talked about Aria and about what came next, and the room believed her. Derek finished his coffee and closed the laptop. He sat in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet of the late morning, and he thought, not for the first time and with a complicated honesty, about the life he'd built in the 3 years since Claire died. The deliberate smallness of it. The night shifts and the maintenance calls and the careful management of a world that he'd reduced to only the things he could control and predict. It had been a survival strategy dressed up as a lifestyle, and he'd known that on some level, and he'd let it go on because Mia needed stability, and he needed to not fall apart. But survival strategies have expiration dates. You build them for the crisis, and then the crisis passes, and you're still living inside the structure you built for it, wearing walls that no longer have anything to protect you from. He'd spent 3 years being invisible. He wasn't sure he wanted to do that anymore. Well, 2 weeks after the board meeting, Nathan Crosswell was formally charged with corporate fraud, unauthorized computer access, and conspiracy to commit securities manipulation. Gary Whitmore, who had retained independent counsel and entered into a cooperation agreement, was charged separately with lesser counts. The legal proceedings would take the better part of a year to resolve. These things always did. But the criminal referral was made and the warrants were issued, and the story became, briefly and breathlessly, the kind of story that technology news cycles loved. Betrayal at the top, a conspiracy exposed, a billion-dollar company saved from the inside. The coverage was significant and almost universally wrong in its details. Every article Derek read, and he read several, mostly because Priya kept sending them to him with brief, sardonic annotations, got the broad strokes right and the specifics muddled. He was described as a security consultant in one piece, a white hat researcher in another, and in one particularly creative account, a former NSA analyst, which was so far from the truth that he'd actually laughed out loud, which startled Mia from across the room. "What's funny?" she'd asked. "Nothing. A misunderstanding." "About what?" "About who I am." She'd looked at him with the measuring expression she sometimes wore, the one that was too old for her face. "Who are you?" "I'm figuring it out," he said. She seemed to accept that. She went back to her drawing. After a moment, she said, without looking up, "I think you're the person who makes eggs and fixes things." She paused. "That seems important." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's the most accurate thing anyone said about me in 2 weeks." Blah. Isabella called him directly for the first time 3 weeks after the launch. Not through her assistant, not through Priya, not through the increasingly bureaucratic chain that had developed as Nexus's communications team managed the aftermath of the Crosswell story. She called from her personal cell phone at 7:30 in the evening, which was when, he'd come to understand, she did things she wasn't doing in her official capacity. "The security architecture position is real," she said, without much preamble. "HR has written the job description. I've been holding it because I wanted to talk to you before it went anywhere formal." "Okay," he said. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, and Mia was at the table doing homework with the focused resentment that second graders applied to math worksheets. "I also wanted to say something that isn't about the job." A pause. "I've been thinking about the boardroom. What Crosswell said about your judgment, about bringing you in." "He wasn't entirely wrong on the optics," Derek said. "He was completely wrong on the substance," she said. "But that's not—" She stopped, and there was a quality to the pause that he recognized now as the sound of Isabella Hart deciding how honest to be. "I've been thinking about how I almost didn't listen to you the first night, how I was going to let Richter's reaction settle it. A beat. I make fast decisions. That's mostly useful. Sometimes it means I dismiss things I shouldn't." "You course-corrected," he said, after enough failed alternatives to make it unavoidable. A pause. "That's not the same as good judgment. That's just desperation eventually pointing in the right direction." He appreciated that she said it. He knew people at her level who couldn't say things like that, who had successfully protected themselves from self-criticism for so long that the capacity for it had atrophied. "The job," he said, partly to move them back onto stable ground, partly because he genuinely wanted to hear the rest. "Head of Security Architecture, reporting directly to me. Competitive compensation. I had HR benchmark it against senior technical roles, not against whatever they were paying for maintenance." A pause. "I know that's a loaded thing to say. It's an accurate thing to say. There's also an equity component that I insisted on, which legal is still arguing with me about, but I'm going to win because I own enough of the company to win." She said it without arrogance, just as a fact. "When do you want to meet about it?" He looked at Mia, who had given up on the math worksheet and was now drawing on the back of it with a focus that suggested she'd been planning this defection for several minutes. I have a few things to work out first, he said. What things? Whether this is the right decision, whether I'm making it for the right reasons. He paused. Whether I'm ready. A silence on her end. Are you asking me or telling me? Telling you. I'll have an answer by Friday. Okay, she said. And then, which he didn't expect. How's Mia? He looked at his daughter, who was drawing with the absolute commitment of someone who had fully abandoned the pretense of doing homework. She's currently defacing a math worksheet, he said. So, standard. Isabella made a sound that was definitely the near approach of a laugh. Friday, she said, and hung up. He set his phone down on the counter. Mia looked up from her drawing. Who was that? Someone from work. The important work? Or the fixing things work? The important work, he said. Then he thought about it. Actually, I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. She considered this philosophical point for approximately 1 second and returned to her drawing. He took the job. He took it on a Thursday, which was a day early, because he'd woken up on Thursday morning and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that he'd already made the decision and had been spending the intervening days performing the process of deciding. Sometimes you knew things before you were ready to admit you knew them. That had been true of a lot of things in his life, and he was trying to get better at the time between knowing and admitting. He called Isabella at 8 a.m. and said, Thursday. I thought Friday, she said. I'm early. A beat. Okay. He could hear something in her voice, not surprise exactly, but the small adjustment of a person recalibrating a timeline. I'll have HR send the formal paperwork today. Start date is negotiable. 2 weeks, he said. I need to make sure the maintenance team is covered. Paul's been carrying extra load and he doesn't complain about it, which makes it worse. 2 weeks, she agreed. There was a pause that was slightly longer than necessary for a practical conversation. Derek? Yeah. Good. Just that. One word delivered in the particular tone of a person who means more than one thing by it and is choosing not to elaborate. Yeah, he said. Good. In the weeks that followed, he discovered that the transition from maintenance technician to head of security architecture was not a clean line, but a long, ungainly crossing that involved more paperwork than he'd anticipated, and a series of meetings with people who had to visibly work at not staring at his employment history with an expression of confused fascination. There was a moment in his third week in the new role when a junior engineer on the security team, a recent graduate named Colton, who was clearly very smart and who had the specific brand of confidence that came from never having been wrong about anything important yet, asked Derek, with barely concealed curiosity, what it had been like to go from maintenance to security architecture. Derek thought about the question honestly. I was doing maintenance, he said. I didn't stop being a security architect. I just stopped telling anyone. Colton looked at him like this was a profound statement. Derek suspected it wasn't, exactly. That it was just true in a way that sounded like more than it was. But he let it sit. The work was hard in a way he'd forgotten work could be hard. Not physical tired, the bone-deep fatigue of night shifts and manual labor, but the other kind. The kind that lived in the head, that followed you home, that woke you up at 3 a.m. with a half-formed thought about an access protocol you'd been reviewing. He'd been out of this world for 3 years, and it had moved on without him, and catching up required a specific kind of humility that didn't come easily. He made mistakes. He missed things. He had a meeting in his 5th week where he presented a security framework recommendation, and a senior architect named Basir politely and methodically dismantled 3 of his assumptions. And afterward, Derek sat in his office, a real office now, a small one, with a window that faced an air shaft, and thought about the feeling of being wrong in front of people and decided it wasn't going to kill him. He went back to Basir the next morning, said, "You were right about all 3, and asked him to walk through the corrections. Basir looked slightly startled, as if this wasn't the outcome he'd expected from the conversation, and then walked him through the corrections carefully and thoroughly, and they ended up talking for an hour and a half about system architecture, and it was genuinely one of the better professional conversations Derek had had in years. Being willing to be wrong was a skill. He'd learned it the hard way, long ago, and then spent 3 years in a job where the problems were concrete enough that he was rarely wrong about them, and he'd quietly gotten out of practice. He was getting back into practice. He and Isabella had coffee for the first time as something other than a crisis management conversation in his 7th week at the company. It wasn't planned. She'd come down to the security floor to check on the new monitoring framework deployment, which was running behind schedule in the specific way that technical projects always run behind schedule. And he'd been in the server access room reviewing audit logs, and she'd knocked on the open door and said, "There's coffee in the executive kitchen on 42. Come up when you're done with that." He finished what he was doing and went up. The executive kitchen was a narrow room off the main corridor that had an espresso machine that probably cost more than his car and a window seat that looked out over the bay. Isabella was already there, sitting on the window seat with a cup, looking at her phone with the focused expression that was her default. She put the phone away when he came in, which he noted without commenting on. He made coffee from the machine, which took longer than it should have because the interface was unnecessarily complicated, and sat down across from her. "Framework deployment is 2 days behind," he said. "I know. I can get it back to 1 day behind by end of week." "I know that too." She looked at him. "That's not why I asked you up here." A pause. Outside the window, the bay was doing the thing it did in late afternoon. The light hitting the water at a shallow angle and turning it a color that was between silver and green. "How are you doing?" she asked. The question was straightforward, and the way she asked it was different from the professional check-ins they'd had in the preceding weeks. Different in a way he chose not to analyze too closely. "Honest answer or diplomatic answer?" he said. "Honest." "I'm tired in a way I haven't been tired in 3 years," he said. "But it's a different kind of tired. The kind where you're tired because you're doing something, not tired because you're holding still." He paused. "I'm not sure I'm explaining that well." "You are," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression he'd come to recognize over the preceding weeks, the one that meant she was actually present, not running the parallel processing she was usually running. She had a way of being in a conversation that was either entirely there or not there at all, no partial attention. And when she was entirely there, it had a specific quality that was hard to be on the receiving end of without noticing it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask?" What was it like the day after the board meeting? Not the practical things, the actual experience of it. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she might redirect to the practical things anyway. "Empty," she said. "For about half a day, it was just empty. Like when something's been pressing on you so hard for so long that when it's gone, you can't feel the shape of yourself without it." She paused. "I went home and I sat in my apartment, and I didn't call anyone, and I didn't do anything work-related for about 6 hours, which is the longest I've done that in I don't know how many years." Another pause. "I ordered food from a Thai place 3 blocks away and ate it on my couch and watched 2 episodes of a documentary about deep-sea creatures." He looked at her. "Deep-sea creatures?" "I found it genuinely interesting," she said, with a slight defensiveness that was almost funny. "I'm not questioning your interests," he said. "You had a face." "I didn't have a face." She was doing the almost smile thing. He'd been watching it happen more often in the preceding weeks, the near approach of something that she kept in reserve, deployed rarely, and which changed her face in a way that was distinct from her professional expressions. "What about you?" she said. "The day after." "I made eggs," he said. "Scrambled. Mia ate them and immediately started telling me about a rabbit she wants. We don't have a rabbit, and we're not getting a rabbit, but apparently that discussion is ongoing." "How ongoing?" "She drew me a 12-page argument in crayon." He paused. "I found it genuinely compelling." Isabella was fully smiling now, which was rare enough that it landed with a different weight than most people's smiles. It didn't look practiced. It looked like something that happened to her face against her better judgment. "She sounds extraordinary," Isabella said. "She's a lot," he said, "in the best way, and sometimes the other way." He paused. "She asks about you, not by name, just she calls you the important phone lady." Isabella looked at him. "That's not—" "It's very accurate," he said. "It's reductive." "She's 7. Reduction is the primary cognitive tool." A quiet moment in the kitchen. The espresso machine hummed. Outside, the bay light was deepening toward evening. "You could meet her," he said. He said it carefully, not making it more than it was, but also not pretending he wasn't saying it. "If you wanted to, not... It doesn't have to be a thing. She just asks, and it seems strange to keep her completely in the dark about a person she's curious about." Isabella looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," she said. Not immediately, just after a beat, with a quality of consideration in it that he respected. "I'd like that." The thing that nobody tells you about building something new out of the wreckage of something old is how uncomfortable the process is, even when it's going right. Especially when it's going right, actually, because when it's going wrong, you have the clarity of failure to orient yourself by. But when it's going right, you're just standing in the middle of something unfamiliar, wondering if you're reading it correctly. Derek drove to pick Mia up from school on a Tuesday in his 10th week at the new job and sat in the pickup line with the radio on low and thought about his wife, not with the crushing weight that the thought had carried for the first 2 years after she died, or even the dull, persistent ache of the 3rd year. More like checking in. The way you think about a person who is important and is gone, and whose absence has become a shape in your life that you've learned to navigate around rather than walk into. Claire had been funny in a dry, unexpected way. She'd been a terrible driver and a great cook, and she'd had strong opinions about furniture that he'd only understood were correct after she was gone, and he had to make furniture decisions himself, and inevitably made bad ones. She'd loved Mia with a completeness that had been almost frightening to watch, the total selflessness of early motherhood that had made Derek feel sometimes like he was witnessing something he wasn't built to fully access. She would have found the last 3 months absurd. She would have wanted every detail: the coupling in the basement, Crosswell's voice on the phone, Isabella in the conference room at midnight, the 43rd credential access event in the administrative log. She would have sat across from him at the kitchen table, leaning on her elbows, and said, "Okay, but what does she actually look like when she talks to you?" And he would have tried to describe it and failed, and she would have laughed at him and said, "Derek, I know you. Just say it." He sat in the pickup line and thought, "I like her. That's all. I just like her." It felt stupidly like a breakthrough. He and Isabella didn't fall into anything quickly or cleanly. That wasn't how either of them were built. And it wasn't how things actually happened between two people with their specific histories and their specific ways of being defended. What happened was slower and more ordinary than that. It happened in coffee in the executive kitchen and in the way she started knocking on his office door to think through security problems out loud, using him as a sounding board the way she used very few people. It happened in the Tuesday he mentioned that Mia's school had a parent-teacher evening, and he'd been anxious about it because second-grade Mia, it turned out, was conducting a small informal economy in the classroom, trading drawings for snacks. And Isabella had laughed, really laughed, not the controlled near approach, but the actual thing, and spent 20 minutes helping him think through how to explain market economics to a 7-year-old in a way that addressed the ethics without crushing the entrepreneurial instinct. It happened in the Saturday in November when she came to his house for the first time, technically to review some security documentation, but mostly not. And Mia opened the front door and looked up at her and said, without any preamble, "You're the important phone lady." "I am," Isabella said. "Dad said you saved the company together." "Your dad mostly saved it. I had the title." Mia considered this. "Do you want to see my rabbit?" She had, after the 12-page crayon argument, won the rabbit debate. His name was Kevin. He was not a good rabbit. He bit things and had escaped his enclosure twice and had destroyed a throw pillow of uncertain sentimental value. But Mia loved him with a devotion that made most of his shortcomings irrelevant. Isabella said, "I would very much like to see your rabbit." And she went in, and she met Kevin, and she sat on the floor of Mia's room for 20 minutes while Mia explained Kevin's personality, and Kevin sat in Isabella's lap with the contented expression of a creature that had caused significant domestic chaos and felt no remorse about it, and Derek stood in the doorway and watched them, and felt something that he didn't have a clean name for, something that was tangled up with grief and gratitude and the strange, persistent fact of time moving forward, whether you're ready for it or not. A year is both a long time and not very long at all, depending on what fills it. What filled the year after the night Derek Vaughan walked off the operations elevator and stood near a wall and watched the company he maintained begin to collapse was a criminal trial that resulted in Nathan Crosswell receiving 22 months in federal prison plus restitution, which was less than some people thought appropriate and more than Crosswell's lawyers had hoped for. Gary Whitmore, who had cooperated fully with the prosecution, received a suspended sentence and a permanent bar from holding executive positions in publicly traded companies. He sent Derek a letter once through legal channels. Not quite an apology, but something in the neighborhood of one. The kind of letter that a person writes when they're trying to understand their own actions and haven't finished the process. Derek read it once and put it in a drawer and didn't respond, which felt like the right choice. Aria launched and did what Isabella had said it would do, mostly. It wasn't perfect. No product like that ever was. And there were scaling problems in the 4th month and a user experience controversy in the 6th that required a public response and a significant update. And there was a period where the financial press started asking whether the launch numbers were sustainable and whether Nexus's valuation had gotten ahead of the reality. Isabella navigated all of it with the specific combination of acknowledgement and forward motion that was her particular skill, admitting what wasn't working, fixing it, not letting the admission become a story that ate the company. Derek built a security architecture that Priya described once as the most paranoid system I've ever worked with in the best way. It was not frictionless. It slowed some things down and frustrated the product team occasionally and required 3 separate rounds of education with departments that found the new access controls inconvenient. He didn't apologize for any of that. He did listen when the frustration was legitimate and adjust where the friction was disproportionate to the risk. Basir became, over the year, something close to a friend. The kind you have at work, the specific relationship of 2 people who spend a lot of time being right and wrong at each other, and have developed a mutual respect based on that, rather than in spite of it. Priya got a promotion in month 8 that she'd been overdue for by about 2 years, which Isabella acknowledged directly and without excessive explanation. Priya came to Derek's office to tell him and said, "You know you're partially responsible for this." And he said, "You did the work." And she said, "You put us in a position where the work got noticed," which was probably the most either of them was going to say about it. Paul Mendez retired in the spring. Derek went to the small party that facilities threw for him, a cake in the break room, the slightly awkward warmth of a group of people who see each other every working day and don't always know how to be socially deliberate about it. And Paul shook his hand and said, "You know, I always thought you were in the wrong job." And Derek said, "I was." And Paul said, "Took you long enough." And there wasn't much to say to that, except to laugh. Matt. The wedding was small. That was a deliberate choice made by both of them, and then negotiated slightly because Derek's sister, who lived in Portland and had the energy of someone who had been waiting for this specific event for a long time, had opinions about the size that required management. They got married on a Saturday in September at a house on a lake, about 2 hours north of the city, rented for the weekend with 40 people who were genuinely the people they wanted there, and not the additional 100 that the situation might have seemed to call for. There was a woman who did ceremony work who was warm and practical and kept everything moving. There was food that was actually good rather than ceremonially present. There was a playlist that Derek had spent 3 weeks arguing about with himself, and that Isabella had reviewed once, changed 2 songs, and declared sufficient. Mia wore a dress that she had chosen herself, blue, with a sash that she'd already half untied before the ceremony began, and she stood between them during the vows with the serious expression of someone who understood that something significant was happening and had decided to be present for it in a way that she wasn't always present for adult events. When the ceremony ended and Derek and Isabella were standing together in the specific dazed warmth of a thing just completed, Mia put her arms around both of their middles simultaneously. She barely reached, and pressed her face against their joined sides and stood there for a long moment without saying anything. Derek looked down at the top of her head. He looked at Isabella, who was looking at Mia with an expression he'd seen develop over the preceding year, something that had started as cautious and careful, and had gradually, without announcement, become something fuller and less defended. "Okay," Mia said finally, into the space between them. "Okay?" Derek said. She looked up. I'm just checking it's real. It's real, Isabella said. Mia considered this. Then she unwrapped herself from them, spotted her friend Cassie across the lawn, and was gone at a dead run before either adult could say anything else, the blue sash trailing behind her like a flag. There's a version of this story that makes it into a parable, the one where the overlooked man saves the day and gets the recognition he deserves, and everyone learns a lesson about judging people by their job titles, and everything resolves into a clear moral that can be summarized in a sentence. That version is not quite right. What's actually true is messier and more specific than a parable allows for. Derek Vaughan was not invisible because the world was unjust, though sometimes it is. He was invisible partly because he chose it, because grief had shrunk his life to the size of what he could manage, and managing required being unseen. The night the attack happened, he almost didn't say anything. He stood near that wall for a long time before he walked to that workstation. And if Richter's dismissal had landed a little harder, or if Isabella had been a little less desperate, or if Priya hadn't run that correlation check immediately, any of those things, and he walks back to the basement and the exfiltration runs and the company loses everything. The thing that actually saved Nexus AI was not a hero appearing at the right moment. It was a series of very small decisions made by imperfect people under pressure, and most of them could have gone the other way. Isabella Hart did not become a different person after the night of the attack. She remained driven and controlled and occasionally difficult and prone to making fast decisions and having to correct them. She did not learn warmth as a lesson. She had warmth. It had just been in a box for a long time, and what changed was not its existence but her access to it. She was still, 9 months after the wedding, the kind of person who could be cold in a meeting in ways that made people in the meeting feel like the temperature had dropped. Derek told her so once, and she said, "I know, I'm working on it," which was all either of them needed her to say. Derek was not fixed by the new job, or the recognition, or the relationship, or any of the things that happen in the second half of stories. He was better in some ways. He still woke up sometimes and had to remind himself that the thing sitting on his chest was the residue of old grief and not a current emergency. He was still sometimes too quiet in ways that the people who cared about him found difficult to read. He was still, at his core, a person who had learned to survive by making himself small, and who was slowly, effortfully learning to take up the appropriate amount of space. Mia turned 8 in February. Kevin the rabbit escaped his enclosure for the 4th time and was found, unrepentant, behind the refrigerator. She started reading chapter books, which she did at the kitchen table in the evenings with the same focused commitment she applied to her crayon arguments. And occasionally she would look up and say something that was so specifically herself that Derek would have to stop what he was doing just to register it. On an ordinary Tuesday in March, she looked up from her book and said to both of them, Derek cooking, Isabella at the table with a laptop, "I want a dog." Derek said, "No." Isabella said, "What kind?" Derek looked at Isabella. Isabella looked at him with an expression of complete innocence. "You're supposed to be the practical one," he said. "I am being practical. Information gathering is practical. We have a rabbit." "Kevin is not a satisfying pet," Mia said. "He bites." "He bites because you startle him." "I want a dog," Mia said again, with the clarity of someone restating a position that she has decided is beyond debate. Isabella looked at Derek. He looked at her. There was a conversation happening in that look that didn't need words, the specific shorthand of two people who have spent enough time together to have a second language. "We'll discuss it," Derek said. "That means yes," Mia told her book and turned the page. The kitchen was warm and it smelled like what he was cooking, and the lake outside the window was going dark in the early spring evening. And Derek stood at the stove and thought about the night in the parking garage when the storm had stopped and he'd driven home through empty streets with Nathan Crosswell's name sitting in the back of his mind like a splinter. He thought about how he'd told Sandra that Mia was right, that he was doing something important. He hadn't known, that night, what important meant exactly, or where it went, or what it was going to cost and give back in equal and unequal measure. He'd just known that something was at stake and that he was the one who happened to be there and happened to be paying attention. That was the whole of it, really. Not a calling, not destiny, not anything that cleaned up nicely into a story about a man who was always meant for more. Just a person in the right place who was paying attention, who had a daughter who needed him employed, who had once known things and remembered them, who chose on a series of small consecutive occasions to say the thing instead of staying quiet. The rice was ready. He turned the heat down. Mia was reading. Isabella was working, or pretending to, occasionally glancing at the kitchen with an expression she probably thought she was hiding. He set the table for 3.